Hello and welcome to the latest installment of the Microbiome movement here at Hanson Wade. Today's webinar will focus on the importance and impact of considering the regulatory status of a microbiome-based product at every stage of development, including the initial research phases carried out in academia. My name is Alex Patik and I will be chairing today's session. The Microbiome movement team here are absolutely passionate about driving the translational microbiome industry forward, and we want to continue to develop valuable content for members of this community. In a rapidly growing area, it's essential for there to be an open dialogue around establishing best practice when translating microbiome research into safe, effective, and commercially viable products across a number of industry-specific verticals. As many of you will know, this webinar is part of the Microbiome movement, a global series of senior level events that we run throughout the year within different industry verticals. If regulation is something you'd like to hear more about firsthand and discuss amongst your peers, you may be interested to take a look at the events scheduled for the rest of this year. Furthermore, we'll be hosting more webinars throughout this year as part of the series and to act as prelude to our meetings. So if there are any other particular topics you'd like covered, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'd obviously love to hear from you. I'm delighted to say that we have a really exciting session planned, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Magali Cordaillat-Simmons, Scientific and Regulatory Affairs Director at the Pharmabiotic Research Institute located in France. At the PRI, Magali supervises the association's analysis of European pharmaceutical legislation, as well as the association's regulatory strategy to support the PRI member companies in their interactions with both national and European drug authorities. Magali, good evening. On behalf of Magali and the PRI, we're very pleased to welcome such a broad background of attendees today. These include global pharmaceutical and biotech companies, leading academic institutions from around the world, and investors. Today's webinar will be around 30 minutes in duration. After Magali has presented, we'll have extended Q&A. Please submit all questions via the questions tab at the bottom of your webinar dashboard. We'll endeavour to get through as many questions as possible in the allotted time. All unaddressed questions will be passed on to the speaker. So if we do run out of time, Magali can follow up with answers directly. Now, without further ado, I'd like to kick off today's session and hand over to Magali.
Thank you very much, Alex. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to present this topic. I'm going to therefore open my presentation now. Okay, let me just change the parameters, I think. Yep, I think this is better now. So I would like to say hello to everybody. Good afternoon and good evening for the one in Europe, and maybe good morning for the one located in the US. So I will talk to you about this issue, which is how early we should think about the regulatory status and therefore strategy for microbiome projects. But I think this is also true for any projects in the life science area. So I will quickly go over the agenda of this webinar. So we will first see how different are the microbiome-based product from other biologics and what is the regulatory struggle for this type of product. We'll see how it is important to consider the regulatory aspects as early as the academic research in what this has an influence later on. We will see how early we should all think about the regulatory status of the future product and how important it is also for the industry as well as the academia to be on the same board for that. And finally, how this regulatory status will influence not only the product development but also the life of the product and future service providers. And finally, I will give you a short conclusion. So how different are these microbiome-based drug products from other biologicals? In order to answer this question, I want to give you the regulatory status. I want to provide you some information with the regulatory status of biologics in Europe. So biologics fall under the Directive 2001/83, which is the piece of legislation that defines a medicinal product and everything around the pharmaceutical legislation. The definition of the medicinal product in Europe is any substance or combination of substances presented as having properties for treating or preventing human disease. And also, there is a second part to this definition, which relates to their function, meaning acting through pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic mode of action. Within this definition of the medicinal product, there is more specificities given in the Annex 1 of this directive, which clearly defines 4 categories of biologicals: the vaccines, the cell therapy, the proteins coming from recombinant DNA, and the blood and plasma derived products. So now, what are the microbiotic medicinal products, as we call them? So first, there is this first big category, which are the live bioactive products. They are now defined at the European level by the European Pharmacopoeia as a category. This definition provided by the European Pharmacopoeia, this monograph will, by the way, be released in the next few months and become binding, are defined as medicinal products containing live microorganisms, bacteria or yeast, for human use. This definition excludes fecal microbial transplantation and products intended as gene therapy. Now, if we look at a larger, a broader vision of the products emerging from the understanding of the microbiome, we can consider a larger category, which we call at the PRI the microbiotic medicinal products, and that our member defined as any medicinal product containing living, dead, or fragment, or a combination of components of the microbiome, i.e. bacteria, yeast, phage, etc., which can prevent or treat human disease through a pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic mode of action. A few examples are, of course, the LBPs, which are part of the microbiotic medicinal products, which I will call MMPs from now on. But we can also include the phages, the inactivated cells, cell fragments, and of course, the fecal microbial transplants. So what is the regulatory struggle for MMPs? So as I told you earlier, there is only 4 categories clearly defined in the Annex 1 of the Directive 2001. And of course, MMPs are not defined as a category as such in this text. Therefore, the registration is based on a case-by-case basis, and there is no standards available at the EU level. We end up in a situation where we have observed discrepancies in the evaluation and assessment of these different products according to the different reference member states. So for the American people attending this webinar, this is how we call the different national drug authorities. So there is a clear necessity to take advantage of the possible discussions with the authorities along the development process as often as we can, of course, when we work with this type of products. So how important is it for the academic research to start thinking about the regulatory status? Because, of course, it might look like it's a step very much far from what they are doing at the moment. This is why I want to discuss that aspect with you. So first of all, I think this is fundamental in the applicability of the research in the real world, and therefore, if we do research even early on, we still want to think about how this research will end up on the creation or invention of a new product, which will then reach market. We are in a system here where when we talk about microbiotic medicinal products, we are in the pharmaceutical framework and not the food framework, because as you may know, in Europe, what defines the regulatory status is the intended use. And as I told you earlier through the definition of the MMPs, we wish to prevent or treat disease, and we have an immunological, metabolic, and pharmacological action. Therefore, we are in the pharma framework. This has large consequences on the development as early as the academic stage. First of all, it has an influence on the study design. We have constraints in terms of proof of concept and mechanism of actions, and this requires adapted study designs. Very often at the PRI, we see studies that were run into the academic world and that are very good proof of concept. However, they are difficult to use in a drug marketing authorization dossier because they were not quite done right in terms of requirements and regulatory requirements. This is an issue because even if it's a good demonstration of, yes, this is how it works, or yes, it could be important for such or such, still we might have to redo those studies in the right way in order to have them inserted in the drug marketing authorization dossier. So this is, of course, an extra cost. And when we talk about investment and cost of the studies, we also have, this is also an important point to consider as early as the academic world, is that most studies have to be carried out in the GLP environment in order to be acceptable for drug marketing authorization. And of course, the duplication of the studies not adapted to the requirements would increase the cost of the developments. When it comes to production process studies, scale-up studies, or just development of, let's say, a fermentation process in order to keep such or such bug alive, we often encounter issues where this was developed in the lab with the raw materials that are available for laboratories and research laboratories. However, the issue is often that those products might not be pharma grade and will not then be able to use them in the pharmaceutical environment. And sometimes, basically, the job has to be redone in order to include products that are usable in the pharmaceutical environment. So this is also something where people should think very early on about the market they are targeting, because this might have an influence on the early developments of the product. And finally, when you work in the academic world, of course, you are looking at developing partnerships. The industry is looking for products able to reach market, for sure, and therefore positioned under the right regulatory status. Investors are looking for products with high return on investments, and it's this where the regulatory status come into place. In the pharma world, we definitely have products which have a stable market for long term. However, we have a big gate, which is the drug marketing authorization. And of course, any other collaboration you want to run, if you are looking at reaching the drug market, will have to be in line with the pharma requirements. So if all partners should have a good understanding of the microbiome, of course, I think it's also important that very early on, all partners have a global appreciation of what will be the general constraints associated with the market they are looking to reach. So probably by what I told you earlier, you figured out the answer to this question, which is how early should I think about the regulatory status of the future product? And of course, you figured out that it's as early as possible. Of course, this will help you because it's going to provide you the necessary guide for future developments, and each regulatory status comes with its own constraints, and it's important to be aware of these constraints as early as possible. And it will also help you directing the studies in the right direction with the right design. It's going to help you also for market identification. It allows the alignment between the market and its constraints. In this market, and it allows you to ask you this important question, which is, okay, in theory, this is the market I want to reach, but is this market valuable enough for the level of investment it represents? Are there different level of constraints according to the market I am targeting for the product? And I will say that this is a place where you might have differences between the different regions of the world. And today in the pharmaceutical industry, we really think about global markets. So this has to be something taken into account. How is this important for the industry as well as the academia? When partnering with the industry, it is important to understand the basics of the regulatory framework of the job, of the products you are developing. Of course, as I told you earlier, it's a necessary guide for future developments. It is important to adapt platforms and other services that you might have to use during the development to the pharma environment. For example, if you have a platform in an academic lab, it might be worth trying to develop this platform in the way that it will be compliant with the good laboratory practices. Because sometimes this is an issue we encounter when we try to put some studies within the drug marketing authorization dossier. And of course, it is also important to adapt the design of your studies to the requirements, and it goes as far as the standards you use, the assays you use, etc. When developing partnership, it is also important to adapt the study design to the industrial requirements, and here again, the regulatory status, the standards, the assays, and so forth are very important. And finally, when academic labs are starting spin-offs. This, of course, takes a higher importance, and regulatory status is a very key question, because it's going to define the level of investment needed, the time to market, and the market access, meaning do you have this big gate, which is the drug marketing authorization, or maybe not, if my product is not going on the market as a drug. This regulatory status also influences your product development and the service providers you're going to work with. It has influence as early as the research and development steps. All aspects of the development are regulated in pharma world, from the proof of concept to clinical studies, and understanding the intended use, which is the origin of the regulatory status your product is going to have, allows to take these requirements into account very early on. When it comes to service providers, all service providers must be compliant with the regulatory status. It goes from the CMO, which must be GMPC if the product is a drug. Same way, if the product is a drug, all your materials have to be have to obtain the right certification of the pharma grade, and so forth and so on. So this is very important when you do your development and when you make collaboration with service providers. It is also important to understand and speak the same language, and we often see that in terms of quality aspects or things like that, it's not always the same language spoken by the biotechs and the service providers. Then you also need to be concerned or aware of the difference between the different parts of the world. It must have an influence on the decision made during research and development. And you need to take into account that it's not only the text and the guidelines and the regulatory framework, which might be slightly different, but you also need to take into account some aspects like ethics or cultural aspects, which might also create additional regulatory constraints in the different countries where you're looking at marketing your products. So I will give you a short conclusion before we open the room to questions. So first of all, you have to be aware as early as possible as the intended use of your product and therefore the regulatory status that comes with it. And this will have an influence on every steps of the development as well as the way you reach market. So you will have to have the right studies designed on research and development, develop the right partnership at this level, develop the right methods, validate some methods and technologies, use the right excipients, raw materials, etc., as well as the right standards. And at the end of the day, your production process will have to be carried out in a GMP environment, and your preclinical studies in a GLP environment, and so forth and so on. So this, of course, has a high cost and a big burden, and it's a big burden on the development. But what really counts here is that this we want this to be worth it, because we will reach stable and a long-term market. And to finish here, I would like to tell you that this is exactly what the PRI is that we are an organization that is not only helping the companies in their interaction with the drug authorities regarding the development of their products so they can move forward in an environment where very few guidelines are available, but we are also creating this network of companies, service providers, which are aware of these pharmaceutical constraints and who understand the pharmaceutical constraints, and therefore can be very good partners in your future developments for microbiotic medicinal products. So this is the PRI team, so myself and my colleague Richard Ellis, who is the business development manager. And I would like to thank you for your attention today, and to thank the organizers for giving me the room. And I think it's time now to look at the questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Magali, for that presentation. Certainly, it was awesome. So over the course of the session, we've received quite a few questions from the panelists. So I thought actually I might kick things off to talk about specifically the EU regulation. And so, you know, a lot of people are kind of confused about what the regulation is. And it sounds like the PRI have obviously a very robust knowledge of the EU regulatory space. So out of curiosity, how has the PRI as an organization developed this level of knowledge? Considering, I guess, in Europe, there is no registered live biotherapeutic product. So let's kick things off with that.
So I will say yes and no, Alex. We do have products registered which are live biotherapeutic products, which were registered in the 50s or 60s. So, but they were registered at the national level. So some national authorities have an understanding of these products. Now, when it comes to the question of how we develop this regulatory knowledge, we decided to use this collaborative approach and this overview approach, which is first we work with small, medium-sized enterprise, so small companies who don't always have regulatory affairs people internally. We work with them, we support them in their interaction with the regulatory authorities, and we try to do it mainly at the EMA level because we have observed discrepancies between national authorities, and at least at the EMA level, we have few authorities assessing the dossier, so they can they have to agree on the answer they give. So at least we have an answer coming from few authorities. By running many of them with many PRI members, we acquire a kind of an overview on the different parts of the drug marketing authorization, so quality, preclinical and clinical. And this overview is then given back to all our regulatory members through workshops and